So what is authentic Buddhism? It's a question we'll tackle coming right up. So I'm Doug Smith. I'm study director at the Secular Buddhist Association. That's secularbuddhism.org. If you're new to the channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a less stress-filled life, consider subscribing. So what is authentic Buddhism? From a sectarian perspective, I think many of us would say it's the Buddhism that we practice. It's the Buddhism that surrounds us. And if we're particularly sectarian, we may simply, wall ourselves off from all the other kinds of practice out there and say that those are inauthentic. If we're a little bit more ecumenical, we may say that although ours is authentic, so is everybody else's, or at least some of them. There's going to be a range of opinions here. Now, from an academic perspective, I think it's either going to be all or none. Either academics will tend to say either every kind of Buddhism is authentic, it's authentic to its practitioners, it's authentic to its place, or many academics may say that no Buddhism is really authentic because the whole notion of authenticity is a kind of a construct, a kind of a social construct, a kind of a rhetorical device, and so there's nothing really to be said interesting about authenticity when it comes to religions. There simply are practices. So these are the kinds of ways I would begin this discussion, to say that there are all kinds of problems here, and we'll get to some of those. But instead of focusing on those and just relying on those, what I think I'd like to do is to get a little bit deeper here and to look at some of the early Buddhist texts and what kinds of things they will turn up about a notion of authenticity within early Buddhism at least. There are two caveats. The first caveat is, of course, a lot of people will then be thinking, so this guy's saying that early Buddhism then is authentic Buddhism. And I don't mean to say that. What I mean to say at the very least, though, is that it's one kind of authentic Buddhism. If there is anything to authenticity, then early Buddhism is one kind. That's as much as we can say. And so as a result, at least if we believe in the notion of authenticity, then at least this is one place we can look to start. The second caveat is that by early Buddhist texts, in particular, I'm going to mean the Pali Canon, there are, of course, other texts written in Chinese, the Chinese agamas, which are basically translations out of similar texts. There are other examples in Sanskrit that are similar as well. Not all of these texts, not all of this material goes back to the historical Buddha. If there is such a thing, some people will say there isn't even necessarily a historical Buddha. So there's all kinds of questions and concerns when we get back to these kinds of texts and talking about authenticity. And indeed, one of the texts that I'll be mentioning was pretty clearly written after the Buddha's lifetime. And so to that extent, some of us may say, well, there's a problem with its authenticity. So, but all of that taken as caveat, now let's get into some of early Buddhism. And if we get into early Buddhism, we see that the Buddha did really care that people got his views right. And he did care about the substance of his views. In particular, there are many, many texts in early Buddhism where the Buddha is arguing and disputing issues with his contemporary competitors. And I have various videos that go into some of those arguments. One recent one I'll put up here where he gets into arguments of 6 of his competitors. And all of this goes to show that he really cared about the Dhamma. He cared about the specifics of what he was saying. And he was willing to say that certain other people were not saying things that were true or correct, and so that they should be argued against, and that he would, if confronted with their views, would attempt to refute them. This is simply a place we can start when looking at the question of what the context here we're talking about when we're talking about authenticity. And it wasn't simply that other people were not correct in their views, it was also that the Buddha cared very much that people got his own views right, in particular his own monks. And there are several occurrences within the early texts of the Buddha berating monks, monastics, who didn't get his views right, who claimed that the Buddha said such and so when he didn't. In particular, we have the case of Aritta, who claimed certain things about whether monks could engage in having sex. We have also Sati, the fisherman's son, who seemed to claim certain things about consciousness going on beyond a particular lifetime, about a sort of a permanent consciousness that the Buddha also rejected. And so in both of these cases and in many others, the Buddha was very careful to say, to really not only say what his views were, but to very strongly chastise monastics who studied with him if they didn't get his views correct. These are then ways that within early Buddhism we can have what we might call inauthentic Buddhism. That is to say, Buddhism that, let's say, Aritta would have said or Sati would have said, these would have been considered inauthentic by the Buddha. They were not the Dhamma. They were not what he was teaching. And in the Anguttara Nikaya, there's a text where the Buddha says, bhikkhus, that is monks, these two misrepresent the Buddha. What two? One who explains what was not spoken by the Buddha as spoken by him, and one who explains what was spoken by the Buddha as not spoken by him. So this emphasizes the issue of representing the Buddha correctly. That if you were going to study with him and if you were going to learn under him, then you should at least get his views correct. You should at least get them right and not ascribe the wrong things to him or deny the right things of him. And in another text, the Buddha says that these kinds of problems of people misrepresenting him in various ways are one of the chief causes of arguments and disputes within the Sangha, within the order of monastics. What's going to happen a lot of the times, especially when we understand that the Sangha would have gotten quite large during the Buddha's lifetime, at least that's how it was pictured, we're going to have monastics who are not necessarily in regular contact with the Buddha, and there's going to be differences of opinion about what he said. Some people will get him right, some people will get him wrong. And these will tend to occasion arguments and disputes because people will, of course, want to get him right. And the Buddha says this is one of the issues, is that people not paying attention to what he actually said and what he didn't say. Now, there are other texts in early Buddhism, in particular in a text called the Attagavagga, but other places as well, where the Buddha argues against or attacks the notion of argument and dispute, where the Buddha says basically argument and dispute are part of the problem because they tend to occasion hatred, they tend to occasion anger, they tend to occasion ill will of one person against another. And so part of the problem that exists in the world is people clinging to their own views and arguing with others. And so we have to keep that in mind. There's a kind of, I wouldn't say a paradox, almost a paradox here, or at least a very subtle kind of distinction we have to make, because of course the Buddha is saying that part of the problem with argument and dispute is people getting his views wrong. That causes argument and dispute. That causes enmity. That causes ill will and anger. But on the other hand, the Buddha himself would argue with, that is to say, he would dispute with monastics who got his views wrong. He would dispute with people from other belief systems regarding their own views. So we have to understand the Buddha's attitude towards argument and dispute as nuanced. He felt that it had its place so long as we were able to engage it without enmity on our part. In other words, without identifying ourselves with the particular object of argumentation, without identifying ourselves emotionally with it. And so we could deal with the question without becoming, let's say, filled with anger, with hatred, filled with ill will. If we could do these things in a kind of an equanimous way, then argument had its place. In particular, it had its place in clarifying the Dharma that the Buddha actually spoke, the lessons that he actually gave, what he actually taught, from certain of the things that he didn't. Which again, we saw in Aritta and in Sati and other monastics who got his views wrong. But these problems also can ramify farther ahead into the future. It's not simply a relatively minor issue of some monastics who, at the time, lived while the Buddha was around, so could be corrected by the Buddha himself. The Buddha then, in another sutta, talks about some of the future perils that we will find as Buddhism goes into the future. And he says that the fourth future peril is when discourses spoken by the Buddha are being recited, the monastics, these people, whoever, won't want to listen. But when discourses composed by poets with fancy words and phrases, composed by outsiders or spoken by disciples, are being recited, they will want to listen. So here we have, again, a serious problem for the monastics, for the sasana, for Buddhism going into the future, is that people will tend to make stuff up. Poets with fancy words will make things that sound nice, that sound very appealing, but that won't actually be accurate as to what the Buddha had actually said. And people will tend to turn away from the words of the Buddha because perhaps they are a little bit less poetic than what's being spoken at the time, perhaps they're not being as well said, who knows what the reason is. But in any event, for various reasons, people will tend to turn towards other speakers. And this is, to be fair, legitimately a problem of inauthenticity. It's a problem of people turning towards inauthentic teachings and away from the authentic ones. And I have to thank a post by Bhante Sujato over on Sutta Central to highlight some of these suttas because I wouldn't have necessarily been able to pick them all out by myself so easily without his help. And I should say in general that I try to highlight where I get some of the stuff in the information box down below, and Sutta Central is a great place to look for some of this information. So these are ways in which we find a real, very robust notion of inauthenticity within the early texts. The authentic stuff is spoken by the Buddha. The inauthentic stuff is stuff that gets what the Buddha said wrong in various ways. Now, but there are some other passages within the early texts that are a little bit more nuanced, and I think provide a good, sort of a broader scope here that I think are also really, really interesting to look at when we think of authenticity of the early texts. I've already mentioned the issue with arguments and disputes, which is one nuanced issue when it comes up, when we come to a discussion of arguments about what the Buddha might have or might not have said, because there also just are general problems with arguments and disputes. But I think more generally we can look at a text where Mahabhajapati Gautami, who was the Buddha's stepmother and also the first of the Buddhist nuns, the first female monastic under the Buddha, she at one point wants to go off and basically meditate and be on her own. She wants to be in sort of a solitary situation for a while. And so is going to be out of touch with the Buddha and with the rest of the Sangha for a while. And she wants, she goes to the Buddha and asks him to provide her with a teaching in brief that will allow her to know whether she is progressing in the right direction. And the Buddha says, "You might know that certain things lead to dispassion, not passion, to being unfettered, not to being fettered, to dispersal, not accumulation, to fewer desires, not more, to contentment, not discontentment, to seclusion, not crowding, to energy, not laziness, to being easy to look after, not being hard to look after. You should definitely bear in mind that these things are the teaching, the training, and the teacher's instructions." And I think this is a fascinating teaching because it leads to quite an expansive understanding of what the Dhamma is. What the Buddha is saying is, any teaching that leads to dispassion, that leads to unfettering, that leads to contentment, that leads to seclusion and sort of ease of dealings with other people, that is his teaching. And of course the corollary to that would be that anything that doesn't do these things isn't. But if we see things from that direction, now we can begin to perhaps even say that teachings by some people who are not Buddhists could be considered a teaching of the teacher, of the Buddha himself. In other words, we have teachings, let's say, out of ancient Greece. We have teachings of the Stoics, Epicureans, of the Cynics, all of which lead to these kinds of ends, to dispassion, to unbinding, to ease of interactions with other people, to contentment. And all of them came from non-Buddhist sources. But insofar as those teachings do these things, and so insofar as they lead to these ends, the Buddha is saying, consider them my teachings. Another famous sutta along these same lines is called the Uttaravipatti Sutta, where a monastic named Uttara makes some claim about the Dharma, and some god asks him basically, where did you get that from? Did the Buddha really say that? Presumably, indicating that it didn't actually come from any of the original, or at least the text they had around at the time. And what Uttara says is, again, quite fascinating. He says, whatever is well spoken is all the word of the Blessed One, the Arahant, the perfectly enlightened one. In other words, whatever is well spoken is the word of the Buddha, or whatever is well spoken is authentic Buddhism, if you like. I mean, that's sort of one way to put it. Now, this is a text that almost certainly comes from after the Buddha's lifetime, for the reason that otherwise the Buddha would have been able to answer this sort of thing directly. And since he doesn't within the text, we can pretty much assume that it was probably composed after he passed on, and that this might have been, indeed, the kind of issue that would have come up from time to time within the Sangha soon after he had passed on, where people would come up with perhaps Dharma arguments or Dharma claims, and some monastic might say, well, look, where do you find that in the early text? There might have been an argument or a dispute, let's say, and somebody might have attempted to get around that by simply saying, look, whatever is well spoken, whatever leads in the right direction, as we saw in the prior text, is the word of the Buddha, and we can leave it at that. And I talked about this text earlier on in my discussion of the history of the Mahayana, because it's texts such as these that may have pointed the way towards a gradual expansion of the number of texts within Buddhism to include many Mahayana texts as well, and so on, because people would say, well, this text isn't perhaps original in the sense that it wasn't around last year, it wasn't around 10 years ago, but it's well spoken, and so therefore can be considered equally the word of the Buddha as anything else. And so I think what we've seen from the earlier texts I was talking about, the first group of texts, which were really quite sectarian, or if you like, limited in the way they thought of authenticity, as authenticity more similar to, do we find these words within, the early Buddhist texts? If we don't find them there, then perhaps they're not authentic. The last two have a more broad, perhaps we might say non-sectarian even, or less sectarian kind of notion of authenticity, where if a text is well spoken, if it leads towards certain ends, the ends that we've discussed, of dispassion, of contentment, of not being fettered, if it leads in those directions, then we should consider it authentic. And so again, that's much broader kind of definition. In a recent interview with the secular Buddhist Ted Meisner, Bernat Font, who runs a secular Buddhist group in Spain, in northern Spain, made a comparison of authenticity with the notion of the self, which I think is very useful. As we know from early Buddhism, the Buddha never said that there was no self. What he was concerned to refute were certain kinds of notions of the self that he felt were unhelpful or unuseful, in particular those that promoted a kind of clinging. Nevertheless, there were ways in which a notion of a self was useful. And in fact, the Buddha then does go on to say that we should have ourselves as our refuge. Have yourself as your refuge and have the Dharma as a refuge before he died. And similarly, a notion of authenticity is one which is useful under certain circumstances. We can say, in certain ways, it can be useful perhaps if we're looking at what the Buddha might have actually said, and we can look at the early texts and say, is such and so statement authentic to what the Buddha said? We can also, and I think in a deeper way, ask, is such and so statement authentic to what the Buddha meant to say? Is it authentic to his general project of, let's say, making for us a better life, of making for us an easier life, of reducing our sense of unsatisfactoriness with the world? And if it helps with that, then we can consider it authentic. And if it doesn't, then we might not. And then if we use that kind of notion of a more flexible kind of notion of authenticity, then let's say a particular teaching might be authentic for one person and not for another. It might be useful for me, but not for you, and vice versa. It might be that a particular teaching just rubs me the wrong way, and whenever I hear it, it puts me in the wrong kind of frame of mind, and so I don't learn from it properly. But whereas for you, perhaps that same teaching brings you into a place of contentment, of kindness and compassion. And so if we understand authenticity in that way, in a sort of a more relaxed fashion, then there is a role for it. But authenticity is also like a notion of the self, in that if we make too much of it, if we really cling to it as a kind of a talisman and sort of, is this text authentic? And if it is, then it's mine and I have to protect it. And if it's not, then it's not mine, it's somebody else's and I have to attack it. Then, of course, the notion of authenticity is not so useful and is actually the sort of thing that promotes enmity, that promotes hatred, that promotes arguments and disputes in the bad sense. I think more deeply I'd like to know what you all think about authentic Buddhism. What is authentic Buddhism for you? What do you find that notion helping you with? And when I say that, I don't want you to get too hung up on the word authenticity. Because for some people, just as I said, some teachings might be good or bad, for some people the word authenticity is simply a turnoff and they just don't like it. And if you don't like it, use another word, like correct Buddhism or helpful Buddhism or good Buddhism and bad, whatever word you like, substitute, that plays the same kind of role. Think about it that way. It doesn't have a role to play in your life, because I think I'll put it this way, even for some of the highest academics who study early Buddhism, study Buddhism in general, people who reject the notion of authenticity out of hand and say it's not a useful concept. Nevertheless, oftentimes if you read their work, and I'm thinking of a few in particular, you'll read their work and you will see that they really do have a kind of a pretty good notion of an authentic Buddhism and certain things that they don't like and try to argue against, even though it's not well developed in their own consciousness, as it were. So I think all of us have certain kinds of practice that we resonate with and others that we don't. And so to that extent, is that, that can be one route to think of what an authentic Buddhism might be like for you. That is to say, how does it impact your practice? So if you're interested in learning more about these issues and helping support the channel, the work we're doing here, check out my Patreon page. It's linked down below. Thanks so much to all of my patrons on Patreon. It wouldn't be possible without you. Thanks also to all of you subscribers. It's great to have you as well. Again, none of this would be possible without subscribers, without patrons. It's a common effort. It's an effort that we all have to do together. And I hope we'll catch you on the next one of these videos. So meanwhile, be well.